Just should do a quick recheck. All right, so original sound is on. Hopefully that is helping a little bit better. And I'm going to keep talking to see, I see deer in headlight looks from a couple of folks waiting for the
You could
clearance.
come up a little more. I saw you at 26.
Okay. And I'm maxed out there. So mic positioning, hold on. So settled in. So this is Liberty White going through a Shure MV7 directly into a Rogue Zephyrus, and looking forward to a great show today as we get ready to discuss this whole bailout situation. Here we are again. What is
You're
it?
in good shape.
10 years later? A little over 10 years later?
Yeah, 12 years later if you're counting '08.
It's a cycle.
Yes. Yes, it is. And Jason, you're the reader, correct, today?
Yeah,
Yes.
I'll be reading for you today.
Okay,
So,
so
hey,
I've
John.
got a question because this is interesting. My Zoom, I'm doing an extended display, and interestingly enough, I do not see the other Zoom pop-up window, and I don't think I hit any settings. I know we were playing around with some things to try to work on my video.
Sometimes it's under the Zoom user interface window.
All right, let's see. Okay, you can all carry on as I look for this. Thank you, Chris.
Did that help?
It didn't, but I'm still looking. I'm still looking through.
And you sure you have the second display?
I do.
So I often lose it underneath, the login window for Zoom.
Okay.
That's where I always find it when I can't.
Voila. Nope, that wasn't it. So promising. Yeah, normally that's where I look and it's like, oh, okay, it's down there. It's okay. We've got less than 2 minutes, so I will make do.
John, I got my Korg Nano controller running my SoundDesk thing.
You have room on your desk?
I had to get rid of all those little souvenirs you sent me. And on another note, my trash can is now full.
Or if you can hear me, I'm going to read your question verbatim, and if there's some clarification necessary when Bill's answering it, I'll address that at the time.
Greetings and welcome to Office Hours. If you are new here and you want to learn a little bit more about what we do, head over to officehours.global. And our first hour is we answer your questions on media and digital productions of all kinds. And our second hour is something that we typically want to spend a little bit more time on. And today we'll be talking about what everyone is talking about, what's happening with Silicon Valley Bank and how that will impact our industry and our economy overall. So you want to stay tuned for our second hour. But for now, producers, go ahead and submit your questions. And Jason, let's head into the first question.
Absolutely. Brody Hefner in New York City writes in, an Oscars broadcast innovation has QR codes linked to film craft info. However, ABC's closed captions placed above the lower thirds obscured every QR code. What's the recommended procedure for preventing this type of conflict?
Bill?
If they are actual closed captions, you have an instant solution available to you, and that is that they are defeatable, usually from your remote control. Often there will be a little button marked CC, and that will take them off the screen temporarily. Again, that only happens with actual closed captions, the kind that are specified by the Americans with Disabilities Act and that function throughout the system consistently. There's another thing that producers sometimes do called open captions. If that's what you're dealing with, then you can't defeat them, and then it's up to a broadcast designer to figure out a space to put something like the QR code in that doesn't conflict with the caption space in the bottom. It's just something you have to learn to deal with, and I wanted to say thanks to Laura Thompson, who also put some notes in our notes so that someone who uses closed captions a lot had direct feedback into that. Thanks.
Courtney?
Yeah, closed captions are just that. They are not rendered by the network. They are rendered by your local television device or your whatever you're displaying it on. So many TVs have the choice of where to place the closed captions, top, bottom, left, right. So you could change the setting in your TV or your tuner or whatever it is you're using to display your television image. If you're watching a YouTube or streaming device, there might be a choice in there on where to place the closed captions. So the network really doesn't have any say as to where they necessarily appear because they're rendered generally locally by the display.
And Alex?
Yeah, the network doesn't have control, but the captionist does. so when the captionist, it was an odd placement of that. When I saw the screen grab of what you showed, it depends. Some TVs, as Courtney would say, will take over and put them where they are set by default or set by the user because it is a separate piece of metadata that's being delivered to the TV through what they call a bank. Line 21 is coming in. It's a carrier that comes next to it, so it's just text. It's not burned in, and it can just be turned on and off. It's not even an image. It's just text. And so your TV may have a default that you set, but if you leave it off and it just says do whatever is going to come in, it actually comes down to the captioner. The captioner will say, I want it to be on these lines. We talk to captioners all the time about what line they're going to put it on. Is it going to be center justified or typically right justified? And how that looks. What it looks like what you showed there was a right justified caption setup, which probably was defined by a captioner and probably not knowing that there was going to be a QR code there. Sometimes the reason that you do that is because you expect lower thirds to be somewhere else and you're trying to stay off of them. So you put them over to one side because all the closed caption will be 32 characters across. And so you know that you'll know where that ends and you can kind of design around that. But it doesn't look like that's what happened. Well, it looks like it probably happened correct for a lot of things. But it, and again, the user can redefine that as well, but it does start with the captioner defining those things in their system. The QR code was exciting. It was exciting to see it. I love QR codes. So I use them a lot for work. And so I'm always interested. The problem with that QR code was A, it didn't stay up long enough, and B, it was too small to comfortably shoot from wherever you were watching, unless you were right up on the TV. Like on a 75-inch TV, you had to be about a foot away from it, about maybe 2 feet away from it to get it to read. And so you need to that QR code needed to be a lot bigger to make it more useful. Also, when you hit a QR code, you need to get to the content that you were promising immediately. Like you can't do anything in between or do anything else without people just never going back to it. So, I mean, I do this a lot. You cannot start putting logins and all kinds of other stuff in front of it. That's old thinking. So what they did is they took a new idea and then they added all their old thinking to it. So when you hit it, you had this log into this, and we're going to give you a bunch of text and all this other stuff that no one cares about. And then people will just stop using them, and then they'll never use them again. Like it was a great idea that was horribly implemented.
And Courtney.
Yeah, and I might point out this is a live show, so the captions are being entered in real time by captionists. So, and it's unscripted mostly. So they're probably typing furiously, and so they're not paying too much attention to position on the screen.
And again, Courtney's absolutely right. But this all happens in pre-show. Like in pre-show, we sit there and we talk about it, and we have them run. We run them. We have the live captioner type it in, and we see what it looks over, and it's our job to make a decision about that. And I'm sure that in the past, putting it over Right Justified made sense because you don't want to put it over the captions, over the lower thirds. The captions don't want to go over the lower thirds, and so they probably the standard operating procedure, and then someone added this new graphic, and it just wasn't accounted for. I think that's probably what happened.
Next question.
Daniel Goldstein from Baltimore, Maryland said, given a Mac computer as a dedicated live production appliance, to get the most bang for my buck between events, would separate non-admin user accounts be sufficient to make sure non-live background tasks don't interfere with live production?
Jason?
I would say ostensibly no. As a rule, I don't like using production machines and Mac computers that are going to be my daily drivers. It's certainly going to help, but your best bet is to get rid of all background stuff and, more importantly, lock down your system. Make no changes, make no upgrades at all. Once you're 2 weeks out from production.
And Jeffrey?
Well, I don't share the same ideal on the lockdown for updates. Being able to using the computer for something else always causes extra problems because another profile gets put on, and if programs come on that like for instance, a good example is Premiere Pro will try to download their stuff from the Frame.io section. So, and I had this happen on my Mac Mini. All of a sudden, my hard drive is completely full. And if you're on one profile and you're getting your hard drive's full, can't do anything else, you're trying to find out what that's happening, but it's all happened on the other profile. Next thing you know, you're fighting your own system. So yeah, putting on extra profiles is not a good idea. Putting on extra software is also not a good idea.
And Alex?
Yeah, I don't know on a Mac if the automatic downloads will happen when the profile is not running. So I think that the profile will only ask for that footage if it's active. So I don't know if that's an issue. We do use multiple profiles on our machines. The main thing is that whatever you're doing production on has to be the admin, because otherwise you get into all kinds of what we end up with is. We end up with errors where it's looking for something that it needs to have full access to and it can't get to it. So if you're going to add those extra those things, and we do that a lot to let clients use something or to do something else, but you want to be sure that those aren't very important. And in general, I would say anything else you do on a computer that's supposed to be production should be very light. It should be checking email and doing those kinds of things. And B, this is also why you want to have a lot of overhead. This is why we constantly talk about never pushing your computers more than 40 to 60% and really aim for 40% capacity so that if something updates or does something else, it's probably not impacting it. And then the other thing is to leave it connected all the time, because what happens is that you plug a computer in that you haven't connected for a long time, and it suddenly wants to do a bunch of things, So you want to try to avoid those types of things and turn all auto updates off. As mentioned before, never have anything update automatically. Never use anything like Dropbox to have it automatically go back and forth, or anything that wants to do something automatic. Be conscious of that and turn it off. And
Jason?
So that depends on if the app or apps in question are installed for all users. This is one of those things when you're installing the app, a lot of the time you'll just click right through, but install for all users can wake up background tasks. Install only for this user. If you're not on that user account, then you're right, Alex, it will not update.
Next question.
Jacob Goodnight from Indianapolis, Indiana writes in, what tools do you recommend to create podcast audiogram graphics? Those, by the way, are moving waveforms that respond to speech audio.
Bill?
There's a lot of third-party tools to do this in a very sophisticated fashion. I use a simpler one inside Final Cut. One of the audio plugins is called Channel EQ, and it has a real-time spectrum analyzer that you can set up to display waveforms in real time. If you want something, though, that's really configurable, I would imagine that Jason and Alex will have other choices that are more sophisticated.
Jason?
Sure. I use Isotope Audio Lens, or at least I have in the past. What do you use, Alex?
Yeah, so the one that I use, that I had to build something that had to look pretty while it was doing its thing, and it's called, and I always forget the name of it here, Vythm, VYTHM Junior. Vythm Junior is a music visualizer VU, and it does a lot of different things. But one of them is it can show things that are bouncing up and down. You can put it in a circle. And what I actually did is I put it into a circular connection. I had to put it on a big theater screen, and you had to listen to the music, and I had to have something to listen to the music with. So I put it in a circle. But then what happened is that its renderer is a little aliased, and so I took that out. So I rendered that full resolution. I took it into Resolve, actually, and then did a bunch of other effects to it. So I added other bits and pieces to it to kind of give it a little bit more of a flair. And then I put it out there and had little particles jumping out of it and everything else. And so that Vythm Junior is the one that I've used in the past. I think Descript also has something built into it. So while you're listening to it, it'll play those things out. But Vythm Junior is probably, I downloaded to do this one project. It was one of those last minute things where I had like a day to figure this out, and I downloaded like 12 apps off the App Store and tried to figure out which one would look the best. And that Vythm Junior was the one that won in the heat of the moment.
And Headliner is one that you can use logging in, and you can create some graphics with it, and it does captioning as well, and then it has waveform capabilities. And you can also do it in Canva, just depending on who you have handling that, because there's just some workarounds and hacks that you've got to use for that. So those are some of the ways that you can create audiograms for podcasts. Next question.
Eric Billings from Washington, D.C. wants to know, does the panel have a preferred Windows app for indexing, cataloging, and searching a large drive's contents, including file properties, metadata, and the header? Thanks.
Alex?
There's actually a lot of them that are out there. The one that I've seen the most prevalent we've mostly used the Mac version of this, but RBSoft makes one that is on the PC that I think is the only one that I've seen in use. I can't vouch for it because I haven't used it very much, but that's the one that I've seen the most often when I've seen one.
Next question.
Paul Terry Walhus in Austin, Texas writes in, what are those astounding LED walls that wrapped around the stage of last night's Oscars? Assume they were LED walls?
Bill?
Yeah, I actually went looking for this, and I remembered at the tail end. I was impressed equally with really the clarity and the beautiful job they did with their LED walls during the whole performance in the shows. And I saw at the very tail end there was a credit for it. Unfortunately, my DVR cut off, even though I tried to look for it, but I think it was Sonova, and I just remember there were two V's at the end. VVA was the end. So I think Sonova with VVA might have been the company that did those graphic walls for the Oscars.
Go ahead, Alex.
All I have to say is, as most people know, when someone asks about an event related to awards, the next day I usually have a lot of mean words to say about them, and I have to say that this is the best best events I've seen. There's some weird camera moves. They did some really weird whip pans and stuff like that were there. But outside of that, I have to admit, I knew there'd be questions about the Oscars, and so I had the DVR on from, not DVR, YouTube TV, it's just metadata, just like record all these things. And so I saw little bits of. I didn't see the whole thing, but I saw little bits from the early red carpet. That happened starting in the morning. ABC just turned it on like, we're going to just do programming all day. So they just program, which I think is a great idea. I thought ABC knocked it out of the park. Really, this is the best coverage. So they a couple things that they did to go back to it, and we'll talk, because we're probably not going to do a second hour on it. Is they took over the boulevard. So they had this huge street. Like everything you see in those red carpets was all built inside of this huge venue that was essentially built on the street. So all the everything there. And it's really nice because not only does all that red velvet, look nice, it sucks up an awful lot of audio, so a lot of reflections, and so it was all there. It looked really pretty. The lighting was done well. What's interesting is that the cameras used in the very early show looked like they were Super 35, and the rest of them went back to 2/3. It was like there was a separate crew that was playing harder at the beginning because they could experiment, and then the broadcast crew came in and said, "Well, we're using the cameras with the trucks." That's what it felt like as they shifted to the red carpet right before the show. Suddenly, you saw the whole background come back into focus. That was different from what happened before that. I was pointing this out to my daughter, talking about small sensors and big sensors. Anyway, but I thought that the LED wall, that's one of the first times I've seen LED walls in broadcast that I didn't see moire. I didn't see any artifacts. It just looked like an image back there. That's a really, really nice LED wall. Probably cost a lot of money. My guess is it's somewhere between 0.9 and 1.2 mil LED wall. And they had it going up and down so they could expose a cavity. Things to look at there when you watch that show, if you watch some in any of the replays, is they put a camera that was on a motorized riser right in front of the talent. And the reason I think that they did that was because it allowed them to frame, with a camera all the way in the back, you get a soft depth of field, but there's just a tiny little postage stamp on the screen that you would see behind them because it's going to compress everything. By putting a camera right in front of the announcers when they're announcing something, they could do a wide angle and get that whole screen, and they had all the nominees framed in that frame every single time so that you could see all the nominees that were framed behind the presenters. Then when they cut to the shot that was like at an angle of the presenters, you'd see the presenters looking out at the audience, and you would see the name of the winner, and you'd see the group that they were in. I mean, I was impressed. Like I was just like, you thought that one out. Like that was a lot of planning. And usually I feel like it's all haphazard. And again, there was a couple of things where they turned that camera, because it was a PTZ, they would turn it really hard in a way that an operator can't do. And so it felt, especially at a wide angle, like I jerked my head back. So that was the only quibble that I had, was they were taking this PTZ and swinging it in a way that wasn't natural. But outside of that, and then I thought the graphics worked pretty well. They had a feel that they were creating that they put on that background. My only quibble was that the text was a little thin for when you're putting it over video. They had a drop shadow underneath it, but it was still like a little hard to read at times. But anyway, I just want to take that. I don't think we're going to talk about it a lot more outside of that, but it's definitely worth looking at in detail, because I thought that they did a really good show, a really well put together show. So.
And Courtney.
Yeah, I thought the LED walls were excellent. And I think there were actually 3 of them. That there was one that was the entire one that went semicircular, that rose up and down to reveal the hole in the middle. And then there were 2 behind that one when it went up, so that they could maintain the decor as that screen went up without having to move stuff in.
And also remember that all the things on the sides were LEDs as well. All those things that look like signs were LEDs as well on those edges.
Right. Yeah. The marquees that were above that looked like little theater marquees, those were all LED walls that had the name of the category coming up on each one, and that changed constantly. Even there were even LED lighting in the audience that was coordinated with the stage LED lighting.
Not only was it coordinated, I forgot about that. It would light up, and then as it opened, as the LED effect would open, it would change the LED lighting of the,
lights in front of behind each chair in the audience. It was all coordinated. And I thought it was beautiful the way they integrated the graphic design, which would normally be done as set pieces, that they would, stagehands used to have to hustle stuff in and hustle stuff out. And then they designed the integrated graphics rather than having overlays of all the nominees in the foreground or coming out of Keychron. They were all on the LED wall, and they were integrated into the background. They were cut out and superimposed over the background to make it really three-dimensional.
Yeah, there is some setup. And one of the things there was a comment on Twitter that popped up that was like, why did they cut? Because I actually watched it because of the VFX award. Why did they cut the VFX presenters off only to go to a comedy skit in the crowd? Like, why did they cut these guys off from saying what they wanted to say and then jump to something that was just what felt like filler? And just so you know, the reason that they did that was because they had to flip the stage. So they it's not that they just went to a comedy that they could do anywhere. Like the problem with all these shows is there's a lot of coordination, and so they needed to go out to the audience and tell this relatively stupid joke, so that they could flip the stage so that they could do the next thing, you know. And so, and the VFX folks don't have the juice to just keep talking. Like they're just, as far as the Academy's as far as the Academy's concerned, the VFX folks are just lucky to be there.
That was probably the best breakdown, a very positive breakdown, a post-award show. Next question.
Steve Podmore from London is just wondering which organizations from Silicon Valley have really stunning AV and presentation capabilities. Is the AV and streaming world big in the Valley?
John?
The companies with the strongest capability are consultation companies like Duarte, and most of the big tech companies will consult with one of these kinds of companies when they're doing big presentations.
And Alex?
Yeah, so the three that you see the most are PRG, which bought VER. So PRG, as far as the heavy AV stuff that goes into the back. Creative is another one that is a big supplier of a lot. You know, when you're going backstage for a lot of these, you're going to see PRG, you're going to see Creative, you're going to see Mountain View Staging. Those are the ones we've worked with a lot. And so those are the ones that, and there is there's one more, but I can't think of the name of it. Anyway, there's like 3 or 4 that do all of everything that you see. There you may have Duarte, as John mentioned. Duarte is that's the high end. Will build your presentation and will help you design the presentation. But then you have a myriad of event companies that will help execute that as well. Sparks is another one that manages a lot of the bits and pieces of an event. But as far as the AV goes, there's only a few that do it. Probably 4 or 5 companies that do probably 90% of the work in Silicon Valley.
Next question.
Frojan Banwell in San Diego, California. Anyone tried out using 1024 by 600 Waveshare display not included, the SmartPi Touch Pro W case kit, or something else at SmartiCase? And he's giving smarticase.com as the reference.
Alex?
I took a look at this. It looks really cool. This is a case that you can kind of put your Pi into, and I believe it has a touch screen on the front, so you can kind of create kind of a kiosk with your Pi. And I bookmarked it for later research, but it looks like a really cool little device.
Next question.
Chirag Chatia in Dallas, Texas writes in, anyone using StudioBinder, is it software to create, it is software to create timeline and call sheets. Any other alternatives that any of you like?
Alex?
We tried it. It's great. It looks pretty. It's easy to build. And then we ended up back in Google Docs. You know, so it was, you know, one of those things that we the problem is there's always something with these that if you're getting started, you will be happy with whatever they do. They'll get you up to speed. Just follow the instructions of how they do it. As you get going, the problem you get into is that as you start building more complex events and you've done it more, you want more things than they have. And what that generally means is you fall back into Google Docs. Like most of us, I mean, almost everything you see generated is always out of Google Docs because it's ultimately flexible. Now, and what we do is we have Google Docs that are all tied to each other. So as you fill out your forms, they're filling out the call sheet. They're doing all the things that you're doing. So you can have all of that done. And again, it's all done by hand. I mean, not done by hand, but it's all like connected by hand, custom. But eventually what happens is you end up with somebody who wants to have more than what the software. And that's what when we tried it early on, and we were really excited about it. And it just, we kept on hitting walls where we wanted it to do something that it didn't do, which is inherent with most of these production things. If you're starting and it looks like it has everything you need, you may find that it's perfect to guide you towards how to do that. Once you get going and you find a producer that kind of knows what they want, you tend to break them very quickly.
That's what I was going to ask is like, who would StudioBinder be good for? Is that someone maybe
it's
just
people getting started who haven't done a lot of this documentation before, you know, and it'll work great. It'll help guide you into putting the data in that you need. But it's not, when I say get started and you could be doing events for a long time, but getting started using all the documentation that they provide So you may be doing this for 10 years, but you go, oh, I need this documentation. It may have everything you need because you haven't been doing that before. But if you bring in producers that have done it before, they're going to quickly find all these things that it doesn't do that they want it to do.
Copy
And then
that.
you end up back in Google Docs because that's what everybody uses. Like that's like 90% of the industry is sitting on Google Docs.
Bill?
The other option, if you're a Mac, I don't know whether you're Mac or PC, Cherry, but it's FileMaker Pro. It's been around for such a long time, and it's really kind of built into the Mac side of the industry. It's actually run by Apple, Claris Corporation, which is kind of semi-attached to them. And it's been developed for such a long time that there's a huge network of consultants out here who are willing to pop in and help you do more complex things. It's really kind of a semi-relational database, and it's very forms-oriented, and it has a lot of web links as well to things like iPhone sub-apps. So it can do everything, but it's another thing to learn.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in, I've looked at portable mechanical keyboards and have found the Keychron K2. My concern is the noise coming from the Apple Magic Keyboard. Any quieter recommendations?
Alexander?
Yeah, that's a tough one because typically with clicky keyboards, that is the trade-off. You have more keys that have further travel, but they generate more noise. I own an Apple keyboard. It's very, very quiet. I've also owned many clicky keyboards, and they have very, very specific use cases. I've never used this particular product, but I was looking at their chart, and it looks like the red keys that you can swap them out for they consider quiet, but I would like to know how quiet that is. They don't seem to have any kind of decibel level or anything like that, so I guess you'd have to try it out.
And John?
There are two aspects of a mechanical keyboard that make noise. First is the switch itself, and those red switches might be silent. Black switches are typically silent. The other sound is when the key hits the base of the keyboard. That makes a big thunk. You can quiet that down with rubber gaskets typically.
And for our producers, this is a wonderful time for you to continue to submit your questions for our panel before we get to the next hour. And you know what? Actually, you can also submit questions for our second hour now. So we have a lot of time to also vote up on your questions and see which ones make the show. Next question.
That's what Vincent Alvarez from Bellingham, Washington did. He said, coming back from commercials, the Oscars were doing a slow zoom towards the host, then instantly the zoom jumped. Was that a purposeful effect or was it a mistake? It seemed to be the same camera, and then he's got a link directly to, I would assume, a still.
Courtney?
Yeah, I didn't take a look at the still, but there were a couple of remote cameras on that. One was the Skycam, a wire-based flying camera. And the other was the pedestal that Alex spoke of earlier, which was a PTZ that was a robotic camera. It was on a robotic base and pedestal that went up and down. And it could have been just a glitch in the zoom servo. Maybe it was an accident. He said there were some fast moves. I didn't notice them that much, that maybe they were set on reframes and the TD took the wrong camera at the wrong time when it was doing a reframe. But if it was in the middle of a long sweeping shot, I tend to believe that it was just some kind of mechanical glitch or RF glitch between a wireless PTZ.
And Alex?
And they did it every commercial. I think it was by design. So it was, I think after coming out of it, they'd come around, it's a jib shot, and it's a jib, it's a manned and operated camera. And it would swing down and then it would push in really fast. I think they were trying to add energy, but I will agree that it was one of the camera moves that I felt a little jarring in what they did. I think it gave it a little bit of a light feel on the camera, which I don't usually appreciate. I like cameras to feel like they're big, heavy things and have gravitas, and so I don't think that they got that as well from that. But that, if you look at it, I think almost every commercial it came out with some big jib shot that then suddenly kind of zoomed in and then cut to the next thing.
Next question.
Alexander Knight from Vancouver, BC, Canada, and on our panel right now writes in, what are the economics of shows like the Oscars? If mainstream networks disappeared tomorrow, could they make it financially viable to stream exclusively on platforms like YouTube?
Bill?
Remember the key to advertising anything, and it's attracting eyeballs to a space where your product can be featured. And there is nothing that is learn these lessons and capitalize on it more than these giant events like the Oscars. I remember reading a story once about 15 or 20 years ago about the swag bags, and even back then they were worth thousands of dollars, and each one of the nominees get one of these. And all these companies are putting in premium items, things like back in those days, iPhones and things like that, because one picture in People magazine of a celebrity using that particular phone can drive tens of thousands of sales. So the entire thing is built around this idea of reputation and building and product branding, and nothing you see on the show is by mistake.
And Alex?
For the most part, most of these award shows are not profitable anymore. Like, so and they've all had trouble staying relevant. I think the Oscars did a pretty good job of making themselves more relevant, this year than other years. But they're having a hard time, and we're seeing a lot of them drop off into streaming. So they're dropping off into live streams to a variety of different services, whether they're private services, YouTube, other things like that. But they're falling off the broadcast list because they're just not getting the numbers that they used to get, and so it's hard for folks to give up whatever the programming was before. I think that the Oscars, the Grammys, a couple other ones are probably going to stay above the line for a little while longer. Could they do them on YouTube? Absolutely. Will they have the same budget? That remains to be seen.
Courtney?
And remember, the top three networks are all media conglomerates that produce films. So you'll notice there were a lot of commercials for Disney movies last night because, Disney owns ABC. So, and you saw a whole 2.5 minute or something, basically commercial for 100 years of Disney or something. There was also a tribute to Warner Brothers for 100 years. It took a long time. And I think all of them paid dearly for that. And since Disney was selling that advertising time, they could take a big chunk out of that. Or if there was advertising that they couldn't sell, positions that they couldn't sell in the show, they could stick their own promotional material in for any upcoming Disney or Pixar or any of the many movie studios that Disney owns into those slots. So it's going to be financially advantageous for them to grab all those eyeballs for promotional material, if nothing else.
Alexander?
What I don't understand, I'm very curious about this, is the underpinnings of the show. Who owns the Oscars? Who underwrites it? I'm just very curious about that.
Bill?
Well, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences is kind of the umbrella organization for the Oscars. That doesn't mean there isn't a lot of other stuff happening behind the scenes. I wanted to just sub-comment on what Alex said earlier about how early the coverage started this year. There's not just the Oscars. There was a pre-show to the Oscars, the red carpet pre-show, and then there was a pre-show before that. And I think for the people who are interested in these personalities and in the products they use and everything else, it's turned into almost like a 12-hour streaming event, as if it was an entertainment version of QVC. Not that they're hawking products consistently, but they do realize that people who see these people and these artists using products, that will drive a lot of behavior out into the vast consumer marketplace, and there's just a lot of money being made out of it.
Go ahead, Chris.
I think what's really interesting about award shows is they have evolved and morphed over the years. I can remember as a kid in the 60s, my parents being so excited to watch the Oscars because it was a moment when they got to see celebrities not, acting. They got to see them just in a casual fashion. Well, we get a ton of that now, so we don't care as much. We're inundated with, Kardashians showing themselves, petting their dog or whatever. And so it's a different market. The other thing that's interesting is that over the years, all of these award shows grew into this, money churning machine. And without the viewership, the money churning machine starts to get gutted. And And I think they're struggling to find their place now. You know, we used to love it, and now we don't need it as much anymore because we get inundated. I think it's very interesting because we're watching a tipping point happening, and who knows where it's actually going to fall.
And like to your point though, Chris, it is, and Bill said this earlier, is just the whole idea of the marketing and the brand options that are now like the Oscars provides that opportunity, but there's so much more money being made outside of the actual like event and the buildup, and why they've now extended it to this 12-hour experience so they can catch everyone else who may not be interested in that like particular time. Jeffrey? Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, it's almost like some guy on the side of the road, you know, pointing at his car and goes, yeah, but look at my car. My car's cool too. Look how nice it is. You know, and it's like, somebody over here has a Tesla. So they're struggling. They're struggling to find their footing.
Jeffrey?
It is a facade. And if you watch the beginning of it, Jimmy Kimmel, he made tons of jokes about it, but it was very true. And then the truth is, this is the Oscars as part of a membership package. And as Jimmy Kimmel said, the members said, hey, we want to see every single award on this show. We don't want an abridged version. So they did every single award on the show, which is why it took 3.5 hours to do that show. So this is, there's a lot of money we don't see getting passed back and forth. We just see the show, and either it's a great show or it's a terrible show. And then we have this conversation every year.
Right. Alex?
Yeah, I think one of the hard parts too is that they, you know, there's a temptation when they write the show to play to their audience, to the audience that's in the audience. You know, there's a big reason why in office hours, I'm particularly sensitive to it. There's a big reason in office hours why you're not allowed to talk about politics or religion is because it separates people. And Hollywood likes to talk about politics on their award shows, and it has cut their viewership in half. Like, you know, and it's because the thing is if there's little barbs, and if you're someone who does production, you look at it and go, oh, that was a little barb. It may not, if you agree with it, it is fine. You know, so for us in California, we barely see that barb because it's just like, oh, well, that's what everyone's talking about. But for people in the rest of the country, they don't want to, they just turn the channel. Like they literally, you say that there was like 4 or 5 little barbs that happened last night, and I could hear where I grew up, I could hear the clicker of everyone just going, nope. And they're just going to turn off the channel. And so this is why, if you want to know why I have such a hard rule about not talking about politics, that's why. It's because you separate you cut your audience in half, and there's no good reason for it. We're talking about movies. You don't have to make those. You don't have to use those. Those are basically, you know, unforced errors when it comes to programming. Those are in the script. It's not some side comment, you know, and it's just a huge mistake that these companies are making of taking any side. Like, just talk about the movies and you'd have a much larger audience. But when you start mixing it up with something that doesn't belong in a events show, you end up, you know, basically destroying, you know, they've wiped out their audience and they're never going to get it back.
Next question.
Vincent Alvarez in Bellingham, Washington writes in last night's Oscars, the host Jimmy Kimmel came out with his microphone dangling. What's the inside scoop? What could be happening in the control room? And what would be their backup plan?
Courtney?
Well, I looked at this picture. It's not really it's only about an inch lower than it would normally be if it's in the clip, and it's still in the middle of his chest. So it's not like it's covered up or obscured. So I don't think they had a problem with that and he is, as the host, is only on camera for a brief period of time. And, you know, the host really doesn't, other than the monologue at the beginning, doesn't talk for that much. I did notice that the one sound problem that I did hear was when he did the joke about the sound men. They were introducing the sound category, and he comes out with a sound rig and a fish pole and a 416 on it. And he's got headphones on. He goes, excuse me, I just need 30 seconds of room tone here. And which was a great joke. But when he took his headphones off, his headphones landed on top of the lavalier, kind of muffling his sound for the rest of that introduction. And there, I think they may have been a little bit panic, but there was really nothing they could do about it since he was on the lav. For backups, if they have a total failure of a lav, they have A2 standing in the wings with handheld wirelesses to run out onto the stage and hand to the person if their body packs go dead. And of course, they have the robotic double mic that comes up from out of the floor. They could erase that if he's at center stage. All in all, I thought the sound was horrific on the show. The background noise from all the fans, maybe it was all those pretty LED walls that were generating so much noise. But anytime anybody was not center stage and was on either side of the wings, on left or right for the introductions and were on wireless as lavs, anytime they were quiet, you just heard this huge cacophony of fans, either from the Vari-Lights or the LED walls. I'm not sure what it was. They could have used some cedar noise reduction, and I don't know why they didn't do any real-time noise reduction.
And Jeffrey?
The full context was that they did a montage at the beginning, and then they did Top Gun, and then Jimmy Kimmel was supposed to be jumping from Tom Cruise's plane. So he ended up coming down on a parachute at the beginning. He had a harness on, and that harness went across the top of there. And of course, you can't put the microphone underneath the harness because that could cause its own problems. So I think that was by design. They kind of did look like when they were trying to take the harness off, they did have some problems. So it's possible it could have fallen down a little bit more, but I didn't notice any problems with the audio.
And Alex?
Almost certain it's the harness. Like the harness just pulled it. And what happens is that little lav comes up into a little clip. And that harness is, and anytime you have a lot of movement around there, that's the thing you worry about with lavs. But with an omnidirectional lav, which is what that was, you know, it didn't matter. Like it was gonna pick things up. If it had been a cardioid, it would have been a really big problem. But I don't think it really affected it. There were fans. Holy smokes! If you look at the Lady Gaga one at the beginning, you could just hear this. You know, it was a really it was really a thing.
Next question.
James Folson writes in, built into Mac OS Ventura has Freeform, designed like a whiteboard and brainstorming features. Does anyone use this for mind mapping?
Go ahead, John.
I do not use it for mind mapping because I need mind maps to be structured and exportable. Specifically, I export into OPML format. So when I'm on my Mac, I use either Scalpel, which is by Literature and Latte, or MindNode, which is across all my devices.
Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Yeah, the biggest problem for me with Freeform on a Mac, I've used it on the iPad. I've used it on the Mac when I have a touch screen attached to it. And that's the big problem, is you're trying to write a whole bunch of notes. You're trying to do a whole bunch of drawing using a mouse or a magic mouse. And that my brain just doesn't work that way. So I need to have a touch screen. So if Mac is going to continue with this Freeform on Mac, I really hope that they start thinking about adding a touch screen to their devices.
And Jason?
I love Freeform on the iPad mini, especially with a pencil, but I do not use it for mind mapping. For me, it's all MindNode. I've used it from the very beginning, and I think it's one of the best.
And Alex?
Yeah, I'm definitely using Freeform and providing, there's a little feedback thing. When Apple puts out a new product, a lot of times there's a little feedback thing, and that team is really reading the feedback. And I think what you're going to find is that the evolution of Freeform happens pretty quickly, and it will be, for a Mac user, it will get to a point within the next 2 years that you'll have a hard time using something else because it's free and it's built into everything and it works. I mean, that's what Apple does well. It may not be as good as Miro or other ones that I've used in the past, but I'm finding it overall for me. There's definitely other people that I've tried to partner with that say, oh, this doesn't work for me. For me, it works great. so for how I think and what I do, building little graphs, all the things I used to sketch on things, I'm using it more and more. So I like it a lot. We were going to have an hour where we talked about mind mapping, and we moved it for the SVB discussion, but we will come back to mind mapping in general in the near future.
Next question.
Paul Terry Walhus writes in, I set up an LG quad monitor with a USB-C cable from a Mac M1 Mini and went through half a dozen cables till I found one that worked. Obviously, there are USB-C data cables and USB-C power cables. Design flaw?
Courtney?
Yes. The design flaw is there's too many flavors of cables. I get these really nice braided C-to-C cables. They don't work for video. So you have classes of cables that work for data only. Some of them are power only. Some of them are power plus video, DisplayPort mini display port compatible. Some of them are Lightning. I mean, not Lightning, but Apple's
Thunderbolt.
Thunderbolt. Thank you. Sorry, Thunderbolt just struck me in the head. Thunderbolt compatible, and you can't tell by looking at them. So you have to read the specs when you order them online if they're display capable or not, and if they're Thunderbolt capable or not, because Thunderbolt data is even faster than DisplayPort data, and it's even faster than data cable, and power. They almost always carry power, but they carry also 2 levels of power. They can carry 5 volts, 9 volts, 12 volts, or 20 or 19 volts. So it's a bit of a minefield out there.
Go ahead, Alexander.
Can you imagine the meetings they had when they were designing this spec? This is an absolute nightmare. I deal with this all the time. The only, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, anyone, but as far as I know, the only way to guarantee it's going to do everything is to just buy the way more expensive Thunderbolt cable and just be done with it, because it's, you got to start labeling your cables too. That's another thing that I've done.
And Jason?
Alexander, you're dead right. In fact, this annoyed me so much that I just bought a whole bunch of these OWC Thunderbolt 4 cables, and they actually say Thunderbolt 4 in there, and I put a red tag on them, and they are the ones that I use for everything. Is it wasteful? Maybe, but my cables always work.
And Alex?
And there are some devices that don't work with Thunderbolt. And so
What?
There are actually a handful of devices that don't work with Thunderbolt. So you can't just be Thunderbolt. It drives me a little crazy. What you're looking for, I believe, is the USB 3.2 version, data version. I believe it's 3.2. Jason might be
3.1 generation 2, yeah.
3.1, yeah, 3.1 generation 2. Those are the ones, if you see them, that they're ready for, that they should be able to do everything that you want them to do. But that's the only ones that I buy, because they're the only ones that I know are going to be able to do all the things that they're designed to do. I find it hilarious that the EU made this the standard. like really? If you're going to pick a standard, this is the standard you're picking. This like total disaster of a standard is the one that you decided you were going to make everybody use. It's kind of it's funny in a horrible sort of way.
And Jeffrey?
Cables are built in LG's case, cables are built for the use of the LG monitor. And most of the times you just throw them in a corner, and then you forget that that's the cable for that monitor or that device. I do buy Thunderbolt 4. I also buy Thunderbolt 3 and USB-C in 6 foot and under. And anything that goes more than 6 foot, I actually got a couple, like the optical USB cables, because they work really well in most cases, not all cases.
And for those watching and our producers, go ahead and submit your questions. And remember to vote upon your questions, because those questions with the votes get the priority during the show. Next question.
Joseph Mueller in Guelph, Ontario, Canada writes in, Chris Fenwick, what is your experience so far with SoundDesk, and is it playing nicely with Loopback and AudioHijack?
Go ahead, Chris.
I would like to answer this question, please. So here's what I could tell you. I'm really enjoying it. I'm really glad that Alex mentioned it, and it got something spinning in my head. I just want to show you really quickly. So here's the mixer that I've built. And essentially what I've done is I've brought in the apps that I want to be able to control. This is the volume to my head in my headphones here. And for example, up here it says, here's Unity coming in on channel 6. And if I ask Mickey to talk to me, go ahead, Mickey, talk to me. Okay, so that's my intercom coming in just on my left channel, because when it comes over on just one ear hole, it's easier for me to go, oh, something's different. And then another cool trick that I did is I brought in all my browsers here. So I don't need to necessarily distinguish between Safari or Chrome or whatever. And the way I do that is through Loopback over here. My channels 3, 4, that's Chrome. See, that's patched in there. But if you look very carefully, there's like, oh, somebody's doing a Y adapter here. And that's because Safari is also patched in there. So that's kind of a cool little trick I did. And then these are basically the things that I might want to play over Zoom. And how do I decide whether or not I want to play it over Zoom. Well, what I've done is I have like the aux send. So as an editor, I'm going to come here and I have a post fader feed of these two channels going out to aux 1, and aux 1, 2 actually is here, and I call this aux to broadcast. And that is muted. And the reason that's muted is so that I don't accidentally send it out to Zoom right now. Later, when I'm editing, I might want to do that, but right now it's muted. And because it's post fader, that aux is post fader, if I turn it down a little so I can hear my client talking over something while we're editing it, it goes down in my ears and it also goes down in theirs. I also about almost 20 minutes ago in the chat, I posted a link to somebody. And when I got into this, I was like, oh, well, clearly I'm the most unique person on the planet. Nobody else is doing this. Well, that's not true. There's a guy who did like a really fantastic tutorial on how to set up basically the same thing. And then the other thing, and I mentioned this last week, is LoudLab has a utility that makes it pretty much bypasses Loopback, but I would never recommend getting rid of Loopback. But all the stuff that I did with Loopback, you could do with the LoudLab thing. Oh, and then one last thing I want to show, which is actually fun. I bought a second Korg Nano controller here, and this is how you set up all of the buttons. And so without actually touching anything here, I'm still showing my screen. If I grab my fader, here I am adjusting faders on my Korg Nano controller, and this is adjusting what's in my ear. So if you guys talk to me and I take my zoom out, I can just fade you out, and then I get rid of all the noise in my head. Anyway, it's really cool. I like it a lot.
Nice. John?
Once Chris had this program, I had to have it, and I'm still working through it. It's just amazing that this isn't built into the operating system like it is on Windows, but good app, having fun time with it.
Yeah, I think it's even deeper than what the Windows mixer does, but yes.
And Alex?
Yeah, the funny thing about how we work here is that I mentioned something I'm playing with, and then Chris runs with it, and now I'm buying the Korg so that I can like take advantage of what Chris figured out. And
is that cool? You got to admit that's pretty cool to be able to just.
I'm excited about it when it shows up. I ordered it from Sweetwater, so I'm going to get it with a couple little pieces of candy. It's going to be great.
Next question.
Jason Bache from Albuquerque, New Mexico writes in, what is the value of an Oscar on the remainder of an actor or a director's career? 200%, 500% more money? Give me some sense of this.
Courtney?
Well, I think it's more advantageous for the production company or the studio in marketing the picture that actor or director directed, because they can now put Academy Award winning movie so-and-so. That makes more difference in drawing people out to the box office or signing up for streaming. For the actor's career, it's hit or miss. There's a huge number of actors that you see them nominated all the time, as well as directors and all categories. They're nominated all the time, and many of them have never won. You'd be surprised at the number of actors out there, famous people who've been nominated, been in a lot of great movies, but just the year they were nominated, they were up against somebody who was a little more popular, and they lost that year. So they never end up getting an Academy Award, and that's why they end up with the Lifetime Achievement Awards or an honorary Oscar if they've had a huge career of work but never managed to win. And there are a lot of actors I know that have complained that after they won an Academy Award, they couldn't get a job. So it was very difficult after that because they got all that notoriety for that one picture, but that picture may not be conducive to their next project. So it doesn't really make a difference in that case.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, the hardest part is if someone is so good at what they do that they get the Academy Award. Sometimes it's hard for people to think of them as anything else, and so they have a hard time, dealing with that almost stigma of that. And it's also hard for them to experiment in short films and experimental films and all kinds of other things because they have this moniker. But in general, it is very valuable to the actor's career and director's career because of exactly what Courtney said. Is that when you're packaging, we're not The studios are banks, right? like they are. I've got a bunch of money, and I'm going to take a risk on something. They're an investment bank. They're going to put something into it, and they want to get the money back. And part of the valuation of the movie is who do you have attached to the project, and so it's this director and these actors, and they have and what are their bona fides, right? And so one of the bona fides is their awards. So that what can I put on the poster, as Courtney was mentioning, and when you do it, like 5 Academy nominees or 3 Oscar winners, and what are you going to put in the trailer? What are you going to put on the poster to tell people this is great? And, and a lot of folks, even I, look at trailers, and if I see no names on the trailers, I usually think, well, it's probably low budget film. Like they weren't able to attach anybody. And so when you start seeing, all like some of these directors that have gotten a really great relationship with a lot of the actors, they can put up something that they have 5 Academy Award winners or 5 Academy Award nominees that are all, and it's definitely in the trailer, definitely on the poster. Does that guarantee it's going to be a success? No. But does it make it more probable? Yes.
Next question.
Frojan Ben, from San Diego, California, writes in, have only used Discord on iPhone and PC, not much of a hit on the CPU. Would it take a heavier hit on my Mac Mini? Heard it suggested in a recent show that it could be causing a problem.
Go ahead, Alex.
I think the jury's still out on what's causing the problem. It takes up so little of, at least on my computer, that I run it all the time on all my computers, but they're all M1s. So I don't know whether it's an Intel thing. I mean, Electron apps tend to be a little bit of a hog when it comes to this stuff. So it could be Intel chips on an M1. It doesn't even show up in the top 20 list of usage.
Bill?
Yeah, I think it might have been my circumstances, and I'm thinking still in the back of my head it may have something to do with Discord, that I'm having some trouble with audio lag, but there is no causal relationship that has been established between those two, and I want to be really clear. The fact that we think that something might be a factor doesn't mean that it is. I could have been entirely wrong in that presumption, and I'm still trying days with Discord off and days with Discord on to see if I can establish an actual causal relationship that has anything to do with what I'm experiencing. Could be something entirely different. I just want to be fair to all the companies involved. It's hard to track these things down sometimes.
Go ahead, Jason.
This comes back to one of my favorite Latin fallacies of all time, post hoc ergo propter hoc. That means after, therefore, because. Just because something comes after another thing doesn't mean that that thing caused the other thing.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in, has anyone on the panel had experience with the Logitech MX range of keyboards? How durable and quiet are they?
Harshit?
Yes, Douglas. I actually do use a MX mechanical keyboard. They have 3 colors, as we were talking colors. Holding mine up here, you have the tactile, which is the blue, I believe, or the brown, excuse me. The clicky is the blue, and the red is the... So when it comes to the quietness of this, the tactile just bounces back. The ortholinear is quiet as well, but the keys press down. So ortholinear is similar to what you might feel in a laptop, where your keys press downwards, where the tactile keyboard, as what they describe it as with the brown switch, it clicks back up. The clicky switch makes more noises, as your old IBM keyboard that you might be used to hearing. So the clicky keyboard that they serve is one version, but the better versions in the MX Mechanical, I would say, would be the brown or the red. As far as this one that I have right here, I've flung off the keycap once or twice on the arrow keys just by holding it incorrectly. But other than that, they just slap right back on. And I would also recommend you look into Kale silver switches. If you're looking at the Keychron or anything else, they are the lightest and quietest switches. And if you want to get really engineering technical, you could get the switches and grease them up and put lubricant and all that kind of fun stuff. But it's a DIY box that you'll get all that with. So,
Jason?
I use and like the ergonomic Logitech MX range of keyboards, but my very favorite to this day is the ThinkPad keyboard, and I managed to find a Bluetooth version of that keyboard. It's super thin, it's super light, and it has a little USB dongle so that if you don't want to use it for Bluetooth, you want to just plug it straight in, it works beautifully. And the benefit here, if you just need to get it to work to plug in a mouse, yep, it also has a mouse too. I love it.
Go ahead, Alex.
I ordered the Logitech MX, tested it, and dropped it off at Whole Foods to go back to Amazon. It's a great keyboard. Here's the problem that I had with it is that I didn't just drop it off at Whole Foods. You know, it's not like sitting in the avocado, bags. I actually took it. There's a place I can take it there. It's, don't go looking for it in the avocados. The
office hours scavenger hunt.
Yeah, exactly. Where's Alex going to leave electronics? Anyway, the problem with it is it wasn't quiet enough. I couldn't get it to be quiet enough to I was trying to find I'm trying to find an invisibly quiet keyboard for taking notes while in meetings, and I haven't been able to find, and talk during the show and stuff like that. Haven't been able to find that. That wasn't it. And because it doesn't have a USB in to plug in my mouse, it now takes up, I now have to plug my trackball or mouse into as a separate input, and that became problematic in my KVM and everything else. So the mixture of those turned out to be just made it not usable in my environment.
And Nigel?
I had problems with the keyboard as well, but I love the MX mouse. So the MX mouse, which someone recommended, I think is an incredible device and better than anything else I've used. But the keyboards, I really struggled with, and I think the search for the silent keyboard is a bit like the search for a dodo. I think people have heard of them. People know they exist, but you'll never find one.
But where? Where are they? Next question.
James Haldane in Vancouver, Canada writes in, has anyone used Canon's RC-IP100 PTZ controller? Does it work well? The screen seems small and I prefer tactile buttons.
Alex?
It looks really good. We haven't used this one specifically, but I have used a fair number of PTZ controllers with touchscreens, and they work really well because they can be modal. You can do a lot more with them. When you create a tactile, the advantage of it is that you can now just not look down and know where you're at, and I get the value of that. But when you create a touch screen, you now can redefine what that is, and you can have pages of things that you can do with those cameras that you can't do if you tie yourself down to a tactile screen. So I felt like looking at it, the mixture of tactile and screen real estate looks very much like the telemetrics system, which we've used a lot. So I think it looks pretty good, but I haven't gotten to use it yet.
Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in 2020, the Emmys were broadcast from the Staples Center partially because of the arena's capacity to support hundreds of feeds going in and out of it. Office Hours 2.5 itself is such a feat each day, but how do you keep track of that many feeds?
Go ahead, Courtney.
Routing switchers. But no, I think the reason they held the Emmys at Staples is because there's so many different categories in television broadcasting, because each little, it's a drama show or a musical comedy show, or best actor in this kind of show or that kind of show, or this half-hour drama, half-hour sitcom, half-hour, There's so many categories that they have to just to accommodate all the nominees and their plus ones. You need something in an arena size just to accommodate the nominees. So that's probably why they do it in a bigger venue than something like where the Academy Awards are held, the Kodak Theater, because it just can't accommodate that many people and have them in a close enough to the stage that you can get them to the stage if they win in less than 30 minutes. So I don't think it really has anything to do with the feeds. They use the big sports trucks a lot of times for these events that are all set up for plugging into an arena and accommodating all the hundreds of cameras that they have, or at least 20 or 30 cameras, maybe 40 cameras that are manned, and a lot of PTZs, So I don't think that's necessarily consideration. Office hours? No, Alex is going to have to address that.
Go ahead, Alex.
What we do and what they do are very different. So I just want to make sure we're all clear. I have a fair bit of experience with most of the facilities in LA, and the Staples is a much easier to get a lot of bandwidth out of. So there's a lot of dedicated fiber that goes in there because of the sports arena. So there's a lot less events that happen in the Kodak Theater than in TCL or Managed Chinese Theater, but we call it TCL because it's owned by TCL. so anyway, so TCL and Kodak have much more limited capacity to get things in and out of them than Staples does. So it is true that the Staples Center and the Microsoft area there next to it and everything else has an enormous amount of fiber going into it. And so that if you need to build individual feeds, it tends to be easier. They literally pull a truck up, or not a truck, but a trailer, up outside of there, and they can run the feeds into there and then spread them out into, again, hundreds of outputs, typically by a company called The Switch. Does a lot of that to manage those outputs to many, many different outlets that may want to use those. And it is not impossible to do in Kodak with some warning, but it is much more difficult. Like there's a lot less capability in that part of the Hollywood than there is at Staples. So it is a constant challenge we have. I'm doing an event at TCL like tomorrow. it's a challenge, so for us to kind of sort that out.
All right. We are at the top of the hour and getting ready and switching over to our conversation around Silicon Valley Bank and the status of the financial industry in the U.S. and actually globally, as we've heard some breaking news this morning of HSBC UK buying or taking over the assets of Silicon Valley Bank in the UK. And so we're just going to have an open discussion about how this is and will impact the live stream, the media production community, but also small businesses, because Mondays, that's our conversations typically around business and marketing. And I know once the news hit the fan last week, I'm a part of the founder startup community. I've been in JP Morgan's Chase's Founder Catalyst program, and those are those kind of programs that help startups get ready to actually go for funding and investment. And that all founders, that was the news last year of how it would impact many of those. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with what's taking place, Silicon Valley Bank, most of their deposits and their clients and customers were startups, were VCs and angel funds. And once they were at a loss or recognized that they had a lot of their funds were tied up in bonds, that they needed to make some moves quickly, especially with the way that the interest rate was going. And many customers, once they heard the news that Silicon Valley Bank was in trouble, and this is a really high level explanation, and as we'll go through the rest of the panel, we'll give more context around that. But once the word got out that they were in trouble, people started to pull with it. And Alex, you want to jump in?
So let's talk a little bit of background here. The reason that I asked Liberty for permission for us to move this to this morning as opposed to what we were going to talk about, mostly because I thought that, when there's a lot of adrenaline, when things are moving, is a good time to learn. It's a good time for us to look and learn and figure things out and work through those. And so I think that it's really useful for us to pay attention to it. Now, you may say, well, I'm a AV, I do AV or I do events. Well, this may affect your clients. It affects your clients. It affects, we have to pay attention to the rest of the world, and we have to pay attention to these financial systems because, that suddenly there's a lot of people that almost lost their entire livelihood and all their employees, and everything happened in a couple days. And these are things that people were talking about for a while. So this is not something that just happened in a day. People were talking about, there's SVB was coming up as this is a risk factor. And let's explain a little bit about that, is that the reason you go to SVB, and I'm in the beginning of a funding round. And so I was talking to an advisor, and they're like, you're going to take the money and then you're going to put it in SVB. like, I don't know if they'll say that today, but they said that a month ago, and the reason for that is that it has all the specialized instruments for startups. So what they did is they specialized. Instead of being a bank that does everything for everyone, they really specialized in all over the world, providing the resources and the tools. Like my company, when I had one, was in Bank of America. And the reason that was there is because I was terrified of small banks. I was terrified of a small bank doing something weird. The problem with Bank of America as a small company is you are like a little gnat on their back. and they don't, if you go under it, it doesn't even show up on there. It doesn't even show up as noise. And so they just don't care about you that much. And so when you're in a large bank, you have a hard time getting any attention. So you go to a small bank that specializes in what you do. And also regional banks do really, really well because they specialize in their region or in a specific vertical. The problem with that vertical of doing that is that you now have a monoculture. You have a lot of people doing the same thing in your bank. And that means that if something goes bad, it goes bad very quickly because it's not like, well, you had some farming assets and you had some other people and some people had brick and mortar. Everybody in SVB or almost everybody in SVB were all startups. And that has two problems. One of those problems is that they have a very specific way of using the money. Another problem is that they are very tech savvy, which means they can accelerate movement very, very fast because they're all in the tech sector. And so they can do things very quickly. So the issue is that, we have zero interest because we made a bunch of bad decisions about housing 30 years ago. What happened last week started 30 years ago. We wanted to get more people into housing, so we relaxed the rules. And then people took advantage of that and they started getting high profits. And then it turned out all those assets were worthless. And that was in 2008 and it all dropped. And so then we didn't have interest rates for 15 years. Like basically we dropped to zero and then just stayed there. Now what that created was that warps the market because it means that you have to buy bonds. And the reason you buy bonds is because there's no yield there's no interest rate to get a yield out of it. And of course banks still want to make money. That's why they're banks. And so they can't pay their employees. They can't pay their investors if they're not making some kind of margin. And essentially when you give them money, you are loaning them money. Right? If you're a depositor, when you borrow money from the bank, you're borrowing it. When you're a depositor, you're lending money to the bank. You're saying, and it's a horrible lend. You are lending money you're lending them a liability that you can take back anytime you want. Think about the bank just being able to come to your loan. Like you borrow $100,000 from the bank and the bank can come anytime they want and just say, I'd like to have that money back. That's what depositing does to a bank is that I'm going to lend you money as a bank and then you're going to give me back. I can ask for it anytime I want. So then what the bank has to do is it's a little bit of a Ponzi scheme. They have to figure out how to make money as long as not everybody asks for it all back. They have to put it into assets. They have to make that money work for them so that they're taking the loan that you gave them as a deposit and turning it into profit. And so that's their game. That's their jam. And so what they do is they start to figure out they want to put it in safe assets because regulatory reasons and so on and so forth, but there aren't a lot of safe assets to put it in. And so you can put it into short-term treasuries or long-term treasuries, and the long-term treasuries will make you more money. So the thing is so what you want to do is you put that money, but what you're hedging against is the fact that the interest rates won't go up because the long-term treasuries are valuable as long as the interest rate return is lower than the long-term treasuries. If that flips and the interest rates are more than the long-term treasury, then the money coming back from that long-term treasury becomes worthless, or not worthless, but it becomes what it is, but it becomes less valuable because there's a lot of other ways to make more money. Other banks because what happens is you buy that treasury, you don't keep it. You buy that treasury you buy a 10-year treasury from the federal government, and then what happens is that you start buying and selling it. And people are making calculations on what it's going to be worth in the future, and they're putting that together. So what happens is they bought a bunch of long-term treasuries. Why did they buy those long-term treasuries? Because that made more money than short-term treasuries. The problem is you have to let them mature. To the end. And so what happened is that then if you bought short-term treasuries, you're making a smaller bet that this will happen. Now, the other thing that happened in the middle of all of these things is that we have incredible inflation because we dumped huge amounts of money into the economy. So during COVID, we printed money like a banana republic. We pushed it all into the economy to keep it going. It then overheated, and then the only tool we have left to fix that problem that we created by dumping money into the economy was to increase interest rates to try to slow the. It's basically like curving back after you've gone a little too far over one side. And that started to flip this bank. It could flip other banks. This isn't the only bank that has this. And basically, talking to folks that I know that are in banks, that they were like, someone should have seen it. Like this is not, like they had a huge amount of assets that were sitting in long-term treasuries. And you have to have the liquidity of your backing be very close, or have the ability to turn it back over if someone asks for it. So the issue is they got themselves into a bind. They had a way out of the bind, which is to raise more money and take a loss on it. The problem is that once they took the loss, they said, well, we made a bad choice. We're now going to raise some more money to fix that choice. The problem is that startups especially, are panicky because they don't, a lot of them don't have any revenue. So they don't have revenue to make up for it. They are startups, and if they have revenue, they have a lot of money in there and they need to pay bills. They need to do things. And because our guarantee is less than $250,000 or less, if you have more money than that into it, you are now at huge risk of your company going under. And it only takes a minute. Cash flow is everything, right? So if you run out of cash flow for a couple of weeks, you're gone. And so the thing is, you can't pay your bills. You can't do all. You can't. It's a huge hit. So what did they do when they found out that there was any whiff of stuff? They pulled money out, and everybody I know would have done the same thing. Like everybody I know in a small business would have been like, if they had more than $250,000, they'd be like, I'm pulling that out of there. We'll see how this goes. And the funny thing is, a lot of people are talking about the antiquated system over the weekend. If it was antiquated, this would have never happened. It was it's a very modern bank with a very modern banking infrastructure, and people were able to move. What's incredible is when you think about it, in one day, people moved $41 billion, and it didn't become a problem until they got to 42. So it was like they did an amazing feat, is to be able to cover $41 billion, and then they hit the wall, and so I think that it's what's going to happen, of course, is that, and the question we really have too, and other people are going to talk about it after me, but the question that we really have here is, should we say that you have up to $250,000 of guaranteed assets by the FDIC, or insured assets? Or should we just say we're going to always insure it, because that's what we do every time there's a problem, is we just go, well, we're actually going to, I know we said $250,000, but we're just going to pay. We're just going to cover it. And so anyway, that kind of hopefully gets people up to speed about what, they got themselves into a bind. Talking to folks about it that are in the industry, they're like, they should have seen this. They shouldn't have done it, and the regulators should have definitely seen it. And you didn't need more rules in regulation. A regulator should have absolutely seen that they had gotten them. They weren't stress testing what was going to happen if what they weren't doing is running stress tests against interest rate increases. But there's a whole bunch of the reason I wanted to talk about it today was that there's just a fascinating number of variables that all kind of congealed into this. And of course, in some ways they had to cover this, because the problem is you don't want a bunch of regional banks to go under, because if people lose confidence in regional banks and smaller banks, they all go to B of A and everybody else, and then you lose those regional banks, and then those banks become even more too large to fail, because more things are getting central. You heard it over the weekend. I watched a lot of news shows. They kept on saying we don't want to see more centralization. We don't want to see more centralization. We don't want to see more of that centralization. They're terrified of more people going to the bigger banks and not using these regional banks, and so they had to figure out a way to solve that.
Okay, John.
I think I'd slightly disagree with Alex that it wouldn't happen in an antiquated system, because it did happen in 1929. But regardless, I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And the act of corporate finance is the act of pricing risk. When something's riskier, it either costs less money or you get a greater reward on it. And one of the foundational problems to this particular crisis is treasury bills started being more valuable. You got a higher return with less risk than some of those bonds and sorts of things. And so the bank itself, its own assets were not valuable assets to be able to sell to get money, because banks aren't required to hold 100% of deposits on hand. The Fed requires banks to hold a certain percentage of their money on hand, and that's usually enough for people to withdraw their money. In this case, because people panicked, they all started pulling their money out. The bank ran out of money. The bank didn't have a way to make that money back to give to its creditors, and so that created a panic. And normally, the Fed does a couple different things. One, they set the deposit amount banks are supposed to keep. They also set and they use that as a way to set interest rates. The other way they do it is by buying and selling of treasury bills. And when the Fed, sells treasury bills, it puts cash into the market, which lowers the price of cash and lowers interest rates. When they buy it back, it reduces the total stock of cash out in the market, and that increases interest rates. So the Fed was increasing interest rates in order to help react against what it had done during the pandemic. During the pandemic, it lowered interest rates to help keep money in the system, to keep the system going. And then that caused inflation because the price of money went down. It was less valuable. The way you combat inflation is you raise interest rates. So the Fed started doing that. That caused the Treasury bills to be worth more money than those bonds that Alex was talking about. So that created a very risky situation for this bank. And then the second part is the FDIC. The FDIC is an insurance company. And what insurance companies do is they distribute risk across a large group of organizations. They take a premium and assume that they're going to make money on the premiums or spread it out over smaller risk pools or larger risk pools, And the reason why it's so important that the Fed stepped in today and said, we're going to back all this money, even though it's beyond what we normally insure, is because if those regional banks if this bank crisis caused other people to panic and pull out of their banks, then the other banks don't have enough money to pay off their creditors, which causes a greater panic. And it becomes a virus that spreads across the banking system. And then the FDIC has to pay everyone's insurance claims instead of a few people paying more insurance claims. So the purpose of saying we're going to go ahead and insure all of the money in these two banks that the FDIC did, it was to prevent the spread of the panic, to make sure they didn't have to pay out claims on all the other banking systems.
Go ahead, Chris.
I think that if more people really understood how banks work, they'd be a lot more reticent about putting their money in banks. But the one thing I want to say about what we do, some of us, I know I do, I guess I should only speak for myself, is I help our company, we help companies communicate. And in times of crisis, they need to communicate. And in times of, jubilee, they need to communicate, or they choose to communicate. And so I can't tell you, actually, three or four different times in my career, I have been involved in live satellite, not pre-internet, before Al Gore invented the internet, satellite firings, where via satellite, I worked for a company once. I was switching the show where the guy laid off like 80% of his worldwide workforce in one broadcast. And I remember looking at the director that day, and I was just like, wow, at least we still have a job. And I'll say, it's crass, yes, Fenwick. It's when you're communicating, everybody has a message to get out. And for what we do, and we help them do that, it is a bit of a job security. Think of the difference between I don't know, Levi's, what was his first name? Bob Levi, making jeans and selling jeans and say gold mining equipment to the gold miners in 1849 in California. Good business to be in, because it was the entry level thing. If you were selling opera tickets in, Concord, California 150 years ago, not as big of an audience, right? So when you're at that kind of ground level, there is a bit more stability in the work that you're doing. And Liberty, you had mentioned earlier, is this going to affect our business? It might. If your business is selling opera tickets, when people don't need that, it might be harder. If you're at the ground level, like what I do, helping people communicate, it's a pretty good business to be in.
Go ahead, Nigel.
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand how difficult this was for a bunch of small companies. And Alex touched on it, and you saw the phrase used over the weekend, an extinction event, that for some of the Silicon Valley startups, had something not happened, they would have ended. And that would have cost livelihoods and jobs and things like that. So the word extinction, I think, is quite an aggressive word, but I think is an interesting word for a lot of small startups who may have been told to put their money in Silicon Valley Bank by the people who provided them or who just trusted them. So I don't want to underestimate the importance to the small businesses of what's going on there. I also would recommend be careful of believing one simplistic reason for this. You're seeing a lot in the press of it was A or it was B. This was a series of issues. It was a complete failure of the management team. The one thing about the bailout, it is a bailout, I'll discuss that in a second, that I don't like is that I think it clears the management team. And I hope that there's a level of accountability, and we should hold ourselves and the people we work with accountable. From a business, for our business, we have, a certain amount of cash we have to keep to pay bills, to cover our loans and stuff. This raises a lot of interesting questions, because you could say, well, if FDIC is 250K, then I'm going to distribute all my money into different banks at 250K each. Well, we keep between $7 and $10 million of cash at any one time, and that's just not a practical answer. And there are bank charges, and there are all sorts of things. So there really is a risk management thing, and you need to make sure, if you are a company of any size, that you are using a professional risk management. I don't know that Silicon Valley Bank's risk management would be a group I would use.
They didn't have one. Someone left.
Right. Well,
a year ago.
Okay. Well, that might be part of the issue, but I think for your business, however big or however small, this is a subject you should talk to your accountant about. This is something you do have to think about. And it might be just one of those things you assume you don't need to, but you really do. I want to make 3 other quick points, and I'll stop if I'm touching what Chris would call the third rail. I think there are a bunch of other things around here. Somebody is going to pay, FDIC as an insurance company. As we use our banks, we pay the premium that they pay off. So the idea that there's nobody going to pay for this, there's no magic money coming. So I think we should be careful of believing that. Second of all, there's a whole bunch of questions about crypto here that are going to come up. Both Silicon Valley and Standard and other people are in the middle of a bunch of crypto stuff. And this will have a knock-on on crypto. And there's a conversation about why the Fed and other people don't want crypto to succeed, or if they do or they don't. That might be interesting. And finally, Alex and I had a sort of tweet conversation over the last couple of days. I believe that Silicon Valley is not the future of technology, but the past. And I think this will start to accelerate, and we'll start to see a diversification both technically and regionally and economically away from California.
I have very much the same sentiments as you, Nigel, and I started to say that at the beginning of the hour, of just the impact that this has had on the startup community. And it's not just in the Valley. This is across the U.S., especially here in Atlanta. The number of organizations that have been constructed to help startups, to help founders. They're women, the number of women who get funding, the number of underserved businesses that get funding. And Silicon Valley Bank was one of the top leading banks that help to fund these programs and to help these small businesses and help these startups. So to see, something like this happen to they were the 16th largest bank in the US, the impact that has to funding like small businesses are the largest group of business creators and funding people who for job creation, for innovation. So just really seeing how that has been impacted. And I know that there was someone from Etsy, Etsy had their funds tied into that. So now you have Etsy sellers who are having issues with being able to pay out or for their operations. So just really want to underline, I know that we are having this conversation of the FDIC and the larger impact and how that trickles down, but then the trickle up effect that is happening for small businesses. And I think it was John who mentioned the fear factor now and how that's going to play into what happens in the future. And then also, hopefully we'll get into this conversation a little bit later of, so what are the products that need to be created, because that doesn't mean we stop funding startups. We don't stop the money and the cash flow to help the innovation and to help job creation, like what happens there, which that part of the conversation is highly impacts our community, because when we have these conversations on a Monday, people are saying, I am currently working here, or I'm a freelancer and I want to step out and start my own business. This is why this conversation is happening today and why it matters for our community, because in order to scale, you need funds to do that. So going on to Jason.
I want to zoom out a little bit. I wrote a thesis as part of a master's degree a long time ago on this, and my knowledge specifically to this case is not great. But I want to point out more of a larger kind of a pattern here. What happened, for better or for worse, is not necessarily wrong. What's different about this is that it is a bellwether. The speed with which money can move can cause this tail ripple effect that, since 2003, Reg CC Article 2 is the federal regulation by which banks are allowed to hold your deposits for how long, under which circumstances. And they have been turned immediately from paper checks to electronic checks legally, and they are identical once they're scanned into an ATM or what have you. After that, there is a single point of clearance now from every Federal Reserve Bank. So routing number, first two digits are the number of the Federal Reserve Bank. That doesn't matter anymore. It is extremely fast. So fast, in fact, that the bank will give you money, and sometimes if there's a stop payment of the check, yank it right back. So the issue that I'm trying to point out here is that the speed with which an extremely connected group of very intelligent people, like, Silicon Valley Bank companies, can pull the money is kind of an advance notice of what I think will happen, to various degrees over the course of, any sort of economic problem as time moves on. And it's not just going to be California.
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that there was no additional regulation required for this to be seen by regulators and told that they needed to do something different. Like it wasn't a lack of regulation that caused this problem. It was a lack of oversight by the regulators that were already there. And so the thing is this was a stress case that they could have very quickly seen had they run the stress case of what happens when you change the interest rates. They would have known exactly what was going to happen here. And so the thing is it is not you don't need to write new laws to fix this. They just need to pay a lot more attention to the banks. That's their job. The reason this is different from 1929 is because that was a consumer run on the banks. And it was able to be done by many people all at one time, and that's possible.
And the FDIC didn't exist.
FDIC. The reason that insurance is so important is because it reduces the chance of consumer runs, because most consumers don't have more than $250,000 in the bank. So when they look at it, they go, "Oh, I'm covered. I don't have to worry about this right now." And so you reduce the number of people that can do that. I think what you're probably going to also see is brakes on, you're probably going to see brakes on a bank being able to run. It will probably get stopped much faster. So it'll say, well, a bank can't move more than X amount of dollars per day. Is probably something that's going to start showing up as a discussion point. You're definitely not going to be able to have long-term treasuries that are at the level that were being used in the past. Of course, those are out of fashion right now because of the high interest rates as well. So I think it's going to be interesting, but I think that it's a mistake to think that. I think a lot of people are talking about regulation and whether it was pulled back or it just didn't. That wasn't the issue. Now, most of the time it isn't. It's people that, it was a failure by the bank, but it's also failure by the people that are supposed to be overseeing what they're doing.
John?
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out the seeds for this were sown much longer ago than any given administration. Our interest rates have been close to zero for over 20 years, and that in order to help the economy grow writ large, we added risk to our system.
Yeah. I mean, this stuff is decades old. Like the problems are decades old, and it just pinched at a second, in a second there, and it is something that. I think that we have to pay a lot of attention to as consumers of the banks, which we have. I mean, you kind of have to be to some degree. That we have to pay attention to that. One thing that the people who did get their money out, just a note, probably had an account somewhere else, because trying to set the account up in a day is just something for us to learn as folks that are as folks who do this, I know we had now the problem you get into is you take loans out from a bank, or you have they get very sensitive about any significant amount of cash in another bank account. But it doesn't mean you can't have another bank account opened. It just means that you can't, like if you start putting a bunch of money into it and you have a loan with another bank, they get tweaky about that. So you have to be kind of careful of that. But having some other places to go, diversifying where your cash is, makes a ton of sense to not have it all in one place. And even the companies that you see, there were definitely some startups that potentially were going to lose everything. A lot of the companies that were uninsured, this was one of the banks that they had money in. So that you saw that, they had $150 million in there that was uninsured. Well, they also had $2 billion somewhere else. And so it's not, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of that was something that they had already done some of that diversification.
Go ahead, Jason.
Alex, I didn't discuss my point or get it across very well. If what you thought I said had to do with, it was a lack of regulation.
No,
what I'm saying is it had to do with the speed.
I was responding to the event chat, which I was paying attention to.
Copy that. Go ahead, Fenwick.
Okay. Jason, you threw me. I yield my time. I will say this in summary of what I was about to say. It was going to be brilliant. It was going to be concise, and at the end there was going to be a little chuckle. But now I can't remember what it was.
We got the chuckle part. So thank you. Just a reminder to our producers. I see there's great questions happening in the chat. Go ahead. This is your opportunity to post them into the panel. So ask a question.
It is a sensitive conversation. We want to talk about it, but we want to try to stay out of the politics of it. So if you start getting in too deep into anything of it, was it this person's fault or that person's fault, you'll probably get the question kicked back. We're trying to stay out of that and just talk about like the overall math of what actually happened.
All right, Jason, let's get into these questions.
Hold on, wait. I remembered what it was.
Better be good. The buildup has been huge now.
Right. Listen. First of all, we're going to vote on this, and then I'm going to pray about it, and then we're going to solve it. No, I read a very interesting Twitter thread the other night about somebody who chronicled their 2-day event of this whole thing, and the guy had a couple of businesses, and it was just heart-wrenching. But I got to say, at the end of it, it got to be like Saturday morning, and he said, "So I decided to go out and play with my kids." And this guy literally was thinking, "I'm losing millions of dollars, and 3 of my businesses are going to get crushed by the weight of the 800-pound gorilla." But he had the wherewithal to he's like, "I decided I was just going to go play with my kids and enjoy a little life." And I was like, such a great story. Anyway, that's it. That's all I was going to say.
All right, Jason, let's go.
That was brilliant. Douglas Carmichael writes in, do you think we'll see a lot of production companies go out of business because of the crisis?
Go ahead, Courtney.
I doubt it. It's mainly a lack of liquidity that this is a major glitch in. And the fact that the FDIC stepped in and said that they were going to make access to all the funds of all insured and even uninsured depositors in SVB is going to avoid the problem of not being able to meet payroll. And a lot of the big, most production companies handle payroll through big payroll companies, cast and crew, and the major payroll companies. And so I'm sure they will not have a problem because of all the money that they're holding for all the different production companies in their bank. So I don't think it's going to be a problem. They will be able to cash in or at least have access to that money in the meantime through the FDIC insurance program. And there are ways, even though there's a $250,000 limit on FDIC insurance for individual depositors, there are ways, if you're using a single bank, to stratify that investment, even if you're putting in $10 million or something like that, to divide it up. And many banks offer the ability to generate multiple accounts so that larger amount can be insured. So there are ways around that. I don't know if SVB had that kind of offer in place for its investors, but possibly not. That may be what caused the problem, where 95% of its depositors were uninsured.
Alex?
Yeah, nobody's going out of business right now, but it's a good lesson for us to pay attention to. Like, what we want to do is the best thing about a close call is for everyone to go, wow, that was close. There's a thing called a crow funeral. It's a real thing. If a crow dies, a whole bunch of crows will collect around it and make a whole lot of noise. I've seen a couple of these crow funerals, and they'll just what as best we can tell, they're imprinting all the environmental things around that crow to try to figure out how not to die. And so when we see something like this, what we want to do is wrap around it, look at what we should be doing differently. Look at, it's hard to control what the world's going to do, but what can we do? Can we, it's one of the reasons that, again, when I had gear, I owned a lot of gear because I knew that no matter what happened with my cash flow, I could still show up at an event and do it. so it's if I had rental, I'd get into a bind on cash flow issues. And so you want to think about where you're diversifying your cash, what you can and can't do without that cash or without, liquidity. And it's a good opportunity. And that's why we're talking about today is we want to look at what happened and look at how we as production people can ensure that because things rarely happen in a vacuum, and it's rarely like they'll never happen again. People tell us that, but it's usually a good idea to plan, hope for the best, but plan for the worst.
Nigel?
I think this is a perfect time to go back and look at your payment terms and make sure that you are being paid appropriate to the work you're doing and that you are not leaving a lot of money out. Because I will tell you, the concern for lots of small businesses here will be accounts receivable will grow because people will use this as a reason, and large companies in particular may use this as a reason to delay payments a certain amount of period of time. And you can say, well, I'll never work with them again. Cash is an important thing, and cash flow is an important thing, as Alex just said. So go back to your payment terms, be really clear about how they operate. Don't just gloss over them, because this is one of the sort of side things that will happen to people in the next few weeks.
And Chris?
Alex, you mentioned would you call it a crow funeral?
Yeah.
Down the block from my house, we would drive by this neighbor's house, and on multiple occasions we saw what could only look like crow church. And I stopped and got out to try and take a picture one day, and it turned out it was this weird sculpture thing that somebody had set up in the front. These were fake birds. And I had seen it. My wife had seen it. She goes, "Did you see the crow church? I've seen crow church." Weirdest thing ever.
Next question.
Harshid Trivedi writes in, S Corp, C Corp, LLC, so many decisions. However, which bank do you select in this process? Do you say write a check out to? How does one get paid these days?
Go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I don't know if we can get into how to choose a bank, and there's a whole second hour on corporation formation, which we could probably do on a Monday at some point at Liberty's if she's interested in that. But how to form that thing. But I know that everybody has a different reason for why they chose the bank. For SVB, a lot of it is because their investors told them that that's where the money's going to go. They're not asking. They're saying, I'm going to give you $10 million. I'm going to put it in SVB for you. I'm not, because it's a system that they know. They know that they're going to have the services, and they're used to doing it. It's a relational thing. And so I, as a small company, was in, again, a big bank, Bank of America, which I didn't necessarily enjoy, but it was stable. And it did what they needed to do, and you didn't ever feel like something was going to go sideways.
And just to answer your question, Harshid, when deciding what bank to go to, you look at their products. You look at their products in relation to your business, your services, and if it's on the personal side, how that impacts you. Looking at how close they are, like proximity. Do you want to go with a local bank? Building relationships with some of the people on staff, because in the X number of years you're looking to have a loan, and then building relationship and credibility so that when it comes time for them to decide what kind of rates or what you can get. So there are a lot of factors that go into deciding what bank you want to go with, and just like that's the quick snapshot response to that. Jason?
And just to be clear, Harshid, it wasn't clear to me when I read the question whether or not you're asking, is there a difference between making a check out to Harshit Trivedi LLC, Harshit Trivedi Inc., or is it okay to just make it out to you? Is that what you were getting at?
And Harshit, feel free to jump in.
Sorry, yeah.
It's getting a little off subject.
Well, the reason why I was asking about the bank corporations and stuff, because that is like LLC is a liability thing. So you're like, okay, let me go to the small bank or the big bank or specialty bank like SPV. And when you invest in stuff like that, and then do we still do the writing out to a check too when we get paid? So that whole process of where does the money go, as a freelancer, you might be S Corp and you're getting paid, but your money's in SPV. So
we probably need to, that's probably a whole separate second hour. where the money goes.
Cool.
Yep.
Next question.
Roscoe Jones in Madison, Indiana writes in, why is or was the FDIC account insurance limited in its coverage? Currently $250,000, I believe.
Yes, go ahead, John.
Yeah, the government always responds to something that happened in the past. In this case, the current limits are responding to, like Alex said, the consumer actions where consumers were pulling all their money out of banks, and most consumers don't have $250,000 in the bank. So there's really a backstop to prevent your average consumer, your 300 million Americans, from pulling their money out of the banks. And I don't think anyone foresaw this happening on the corporate level.
Alex?
Safety creates bad behavior. That's why you don't, but when you insure, the more you insure, the more risk people will take. And so the reason that they keep this, and this is the hard part of what we're doing now by bailing everybody out, is that we are making it safe. Everyone now assumes, after 2008, they made the initial assumption with this, which has turned out to be true, is that everybody's too big to fail. And so we're going to constantly, back it up. But what that will create is risk-taking. And so because you go, well, I know that it'll always be safe to do it. And one of the big things that makes, the semi-capitalistic system that we do, which isn't really capitalistic, mostly socialistic, but we kind of call it capitalism, is that when we create, the idea is the check and balance of risk-taking is loss. And if we take all the loss away, we end up with a lot of risk-taking. And eventually that, we see what happened in 2008 was a lot of risk-taking based on what felt like safety. And so we have to be very careful of it. But that's why they limit what that number is so that you don't start doing crazy things with the money. And which it still wasn't enough. But that sense of safety creates bad behaviors.
Courtney?
Yeah, it's created for security to attract investors or people to put their money into the bank, as opposed to, hiding it under their mattress or giving it to Uncle Bob to keep somewhere. It's an incentive. People can feel safe if they know. And most depositors, beyond corporate investors, aren't putting more than $250,000 in cash into a bank. So they feel pretty safe in their money. And after the runs on the banks in the 20s and in 2008, that was up from $100,000 once the FDIC was formed. It used to be just $100,000. And so banks would advertise, your deposits are insured by the federal government up to $100,000. Well, after 2008, it went to $250,000 because a lot of people were way beyond that $100,000 in investments and savings and, the various accounts that you would have at a single bank. So they upped it to $250,000, and it's to encourage the banks to stay in business and not have people pull their money out of banks and go to Bitcoin or something other than a structured bank.
John?
I'm not positive this is the case, but I believe the reason why the FDIC is just insuring the deposits is they want to enable the bank to continue to fail because the stockholders and bank management are not protected with this. I think the hope is that people will keep their money, and it gives the opportunity for the bank itself to fail.
And Alex?
And again, to make it crystal clear, one of the big advantages of $250,000 is that the vast majority of consumers are not going to make a run on the bank. Like if they know that it's not only will they feel secure to put the money in the bank, but they know that no matter what, if they don't go over $250,000, that there's no reason for them to call their banker when they see some problem with the bank because they're going to be covered. And so they don't think about it, they don't move. And that panic that we saw here was related to the fact that there was a lot of people over that $250,000. So if we said the FDIC automatically insures everyone, then you would end up with the panic wouldn't have occurred. The problem with that is, again, people take risks at that point, and to get rid of those risks, what you have to do is now the government has to protect itself. When it says that I'm going to back up everything, I have to protect myself, which is a lot more regulation, which makes it a lot harder for regional banks to survive, which makes it, and then they have to add a lot more rules. And so when you add it's easy to say we should just regulate the heck out of the banks, but when you do that, it makes it harder for them to lend to average people and to individuals because they have all this regulation about what they can and can't do. And if you wonder why you can't get your next loan for your credit card or your bank or whatever, it's because of the regulations that are there. They would love to give you that loan, but there's regulations there. And the more they back, the more regulations they're going to have because otherwise it could, it's a lot of money that's floating around. The contagion could be very expensive to the taxpayer if you go down that path.
And Chris?
Preto just sent me this. It's a list of failed banks by the FDIC. I think it's important to notice here that although Signature Bank today and Silicon Bank last week were failed or whatever, taken over, previous to that, there was 4 banks in 2020, and then going back to 2019 and 2017. This doesn't happen a lot. I don't think there's a whole lot of, need for crazy panic.
Next question.
Speaking of which, Peter Belbin in Houston writes in, how does SVB's situation compare with that of Signature Bank, which has also become a casualty over the weekend?
Alex?
My understanding, I haven't paid as much attention to Signature Bank, but I think my understanding is they were in a very similar boat, which is they got themselves, kind of over their skis when it comes to where they were putting investments. And this is where, again, your banks essentially trying to maximize their profits by taking long-term plays against short-term deposits. And that works great, and it's great for the shareholders, and it generates profits and everything else, as long as the shareholders don't panic. And it even works out okay if the shareholders just leave their money in there. These banks can make that happen. The problem is that if they suddenly constrict, in both of these cases, in SVB, from my understanding, is that you just have the market for raising money constricted. And so that also meant that more of the startups were not getting the next 20 million, the next 50 million. They were needed to work with the money that they had. So they started pulling more and more resources out of it after a huge wave. I think they tripled in size during COVID because there was so much investment in new technologies. But then it's, as often happens, things slow down in Silicon Valley, and then people start just using the money that they had. And that increased draw is what started to create this kind of chain reaction.
Next question.
Eric Billings in Washington, D.C. writes in, while probably not intentional, do you think the crypto debacles have been allowed to proceed to burn up a lot of the extra money dumped into the system from the 2008 COVID stimuli, perhaps in a failed attempt to head off this type of event?
Alex?
I think they had their own, crypto had its own issues that I don't think were necessarily connected to, they're very speculative right now because they're kind of the wild, wild west. And so I don't think that the crypto debacle, the problem is that the crypto debacle really is much closer to the pure capitalism where it just, you live and die by what you're doing. There's no government intervention, but there's also no government protection.
And I don't remember what the stable one is right now in crypto, but there is conversation of what's happening now with SVB and how that will impact them. So it'll be interesting to see in like the next week or so what we do see on that end of things, while crypto is not necessarily directly impacting this case, but it will be the reverse. Nigel?
Yeah, the only thing to add to the crypto is I think if you went back a few thousand years and looked at the first use of money, you would see fraud, and you'd see confusion, and you'd see people losing money, losing value and stuff. So crypto's very like cash was, 5,000-10,000 years ago, whenever it came out. So you're going to see these massive changes as people work it out. I think there are a set of issues for a government which can control and print money when it can't control and print crypto. And so there is a set of friction, and there is a set of dynamics going on there that will change the way some of this works. Those of us, I dabble a little bit just to play, And suddenly my Coinbase account required me to declare it on my taxes. So you are going to see some of the assumptions around crypto really butt up against some of this stuff, but I don't think that was an issue here.
And Alex?
And just to build off of what Nigel said, is there, as Americans, we, not everyone who's watching it is American. As Americans, we have an incredible luxury that we have the dollar that everybody uses for the base, of everything. And so we can do a lot of things that other countries can't. It's not just that things go up and down 10,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. In many parts of the world, the money valuation goes up and down by huge numbers relatively often. So it's something that is it's not new to crypto. It's just new to something that isn't the fiat currency.
Next question.
Marco De Andrade from Lacombe, Alberta, Canada writes in, do you think the Fed will continue raising the rates in the short term? Will SMBs businesses change their mindsets on expected economic growth as the result of this event?
Go ahead, John.
I think they'll, in some ways, have to continue to raise rates because by backstopping these bank failures, they're essentially injecting more cash into the system, and increasing the supply decreases the cost, and that's going to lower the cost of capital. In general, small and medium-sized businesses should be assuming that the cost of capital will not remain at zero as long as we are dealing with high inflation still from the last couple of years.
And Alex?
Yeah, they're going to have to keep on increasing those interest rates because the inflation is so high. Inflation is the worst tax because it not only taxes your income, it taxes your savings. And it is a permanent tax. It is literally the worst. If you wonder why some people are freaked out about inflation and some people say it's not a big deal, people who say it's not a big deal don't have any savings. They don't have anything, that's there and they can just change that, but it is we've applied a 20% over the last couple of years, a 20% tax on what people saved for their retirement. Like, it is an incredible problem that the Fed has to fix. And so, yes, interest rates are going to keep on going up because they have to fix. We are bleeding out. People's savings is bleeding out right now, and they're trying to apply pressure to keep it from getting any worse than it already is.
And Chris?
To put that comment into perspective, my father, who passed away in 2006, always told the boys, my brothers and I, you'll never have to worry about your mother. There's no way that she could spend all the money. What my dad did not take into consideration, number one, is that my mother would live so far 17 years longer than my dad. And also, he had no idea that a gallon of gasoline would ever get to be $7 and a dozen eggs would be $12 or whatever they are now or were. So talking about inflation being something that, really hits you at both ends, my mother is out of money. My dad never envisioned the world that my mother is currently living in.
Which is why this conversation is so important, and happy that we're able to have this today. Next question.
Douglas Carmichael writes in, how would the European Commission be monitoring the crisis, and what actions might the EU take in response?
Nigel?
So the EU is a competitor for the US. I know it doesn't probably sound like it, but they are. And so they will be doing two things. They will be doing a lot of nothing, but making sound and fury signifying nothing. But they will also be looking to see what they can do to strengthen the bank issues within Europe and then between the Europe and the US. So you're going to see a lot of action. I don't know what will amount to anything, but they do view the issues around contagion and competition as something they have to keep an eye on.
Next question.
Joe Kidd from the Bay Area writes in, while decreasing tax revenues in the trillions of dollars and increasing spending, did the untoward, undue, and unprecedented pressure on the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank to irrationally hold prime rates exacerbate SVB's liquidity crisis?
Go ahead, John.
The Fed is an independent organization. Now, I think it's arguable that decreasing tax revenues and increasing spending could increase inflation because you're basically leaving money in the system. Tax takes money out of the system and spending puts money into the system. I think that's different than this particular crisis. My personal opinion is this particular crisis was with low cost of capital, large businesses grew faster than they should have, and the bank wasn't set to guard against that.
Alex?
And again, I mean, we can talk. That's a whole other good discussion. It's probably too political for us to get into in too deep into that process. But what happened here was that the bank did the wrong thing. We can talk. There's a lot of other things that are swirling around. But again, talking to folks that are in banks, they were like, this was an obvious thing. Like anybody could have looked at the books and said, you are leveraged. And as soon as we started talking about increasing interest rates, this should have been a giant on the top of a building swinging a red flag over any bank that was doing long-term treasuries. As soon as the Fed started to increase it didn't matter how. I mean, they've been doing this over years, not over. This is why the Fed doesn't just go to 4%. They start eking it up so people can start making adjustments. And while it did do it faster than any other time in 40 years, this is something that it came down to the bank made bad choices that could have been seen. And everybody can get away with all kinds of bad behavior when things are when it's sunny. When it rains, you figure out who had rain gear and who didn't.
Jason?
Yeah, to reiterate that point, the chairman did not cause this problem. The Federal Reserve Bank did not cause this problem. The prime rates directly did not cause this problem. Only the bank caused this problem.
And John?
I think it's important to remember this bank, not only was it highly leveraged in maybe a way that wasn't sustainable, it also wasn't diversified. All of its assets were essentially in tech companies and tech businesses. So when those struggled over the last few months, that made things even worse. And
Alex?
And as a victim of someone with I lost my company because I wasn't diversified. So this is what happens when you get into a monoculture. While I thought that I worked with lots of big companies and so I was okay, they were all using one streaming platform. So when that streaming platform shifted, what I thought was diversification suddenly it was clear that it was all dependent on one thing. So one thing that we can walk away from, and I think John made a great point of that monoculture that was created, is that as a business, one thing to learn is that monocultures are not good for you. And so you want to be looking for clients. And one of the mistakes that I made as a company was that I didn't do any advertising or marketing because I had so much work. I was like, well, what am I going to do with more marketing? What am I going to do with more work? Well, what it meant was I could have diversified. I could have picked and choose other clients to start, doing things with, as opposed to just taking in what came in, which if you only take in what comes in, you can very quickly end up in a monoculture because someone just fills up your entire pipe. So it is an important thing. And the last thing I wanted to show here before we jump away is crow funeral. In case you thought I was making it up. There it is. I just searched crow funeral. There it is, a dead crow and a bunch of crows trying to figure out what happened.
Well, thank you so much to our producers for your phenomenal questions this was like breaking news. We switched the topic today just so that we could have this conversation. So let us know in second hours what has spawned and sparked for you so that we can continue this dialogue. And to our panelists, thank you for your contribution. And most importantly, to our back end team, for without which this would not be possible. And just touching on the rest of the week, tomorrow we've got Alan Hawks, and he'll be our second hour. And if you want to see the rest of the schedule, head over to officehours.global. And we can't forget the Taluk Traversal. We've gone 33,972,000 miles. That's 54,672 kilometers. That's more than 307 million bananas. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in after hours. Bye.
Apologies if I butchered anyone's names.
Congrats on reading today, Jason. Thank you so much. Yes. That's a great topic.
It's fiscal policy just really gets my blood pumping.
Economics is like my second love.
It's my favorite sport.
Exactly. Let's just start another podcast where all we talk about is macroeconomics.
Sounds great. Guess that's what he said to say about it, macroeconomics.
Macaroni, macroeconomics and cheese.
Macaroni economics. There it is.